you awaken in the chill of Westminster Abbey, the cold stone biting through the thin wool of your cloak. The scent of damp masonry mingles with the sharp tang of burning beeswax, and the sunlight, fractured by stained glass, spills in slivers of crimson and gold across the flagstone floor. Somewhere in the distance, the hollow echo of a bell tolls, each strike reminding you that history itself is unfolding in these solemn halls. Outside, courtiers whisper in hushed tones about an impossible union. A girl, no older than 6, traveling from France to wed a man nearly 5 times her age. A king whose power looms like the shadows gathering in the nave. If you are marveling at this story from somewhere across the globe, consider pausing to like and subscribe so more forgotten histories can reach you. Comment below to share where you are watching from. How remarkable it is that we are connected through centuries of human drama, observing the same echoes of fear, duty, and ambition that shaped kingdoms. Every view becomes a thread in the vast tapestry of curiosity linking the present to the medieval past. Isabella of Valois was born into the glittering turbulence of the French court, her earliest days marked by both luxury and unease. The Louvre Palace offered rooms drenched in sunlight, yet each gilded chamber whispered reminders of fragility. Her father, Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, alternated between moments of regal command and terrifying episodes in which he saw invisible assassins or believed his own body was made of glass. The young princess learned quickly that even the smallest misstep could summon terror or abrupt flight. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, vigilant and calculating, understood that Isabella's life, delicate as it was, would serve the ambitions of crowns rather than the comforts of childhood. At 6, Isabella was sent across the Channel, escorted by a retinue of French nobles and servants who had been briefed on every ceremonial detail. The English coast, stark and windswept, welcomed her with an air of both expectation and unease. She was a tiny figure against the formidable backdrop of English power, her embroidered gown almost too heavy for her small frame, her dark hair braided with pearls that pressed lightly against her scalp. The sight of Richard II, tall, imposing, yet visibly softened by grief over his first wife Anne of Bohemia, must have been at once intimidating and strangely comforting. Richard, 29 years old, had lost the woman he loved only a year prior, and in Isabella's presence the remnants of that tenderness surfaced in subtle gestures, a guiding hand, a soft-spoken word, a nod of encouragement during the long ceremonial preparations. The marriage itself, as historians would later note, was less a joining of hearts than a pact of peace. Negotiators from England and France orchestrated every detail, from the exchange of gifts to the precise timing of the vows, ensuring that Isabella's youth became a symbol of purity and hope rather than scandal. The wedding day at Calais Castle, an English-controlled port in France, unfolded with careful choreography. Richard knelt to match Isabella's height as she presented her small hand, and witnesses recorded the gentleness with which he adjusted her chin when she faltered under the gaze of assembled nobles. Every gesture, every glance, became a public declaration. This child was now queen, and her presence would bind 2 kingdoms in the tenuous promise of truce. Following the formalities, Isabella was crowned in Westminster Abbey the next year, at the tender age of 7. The English streets had never seen such curiosity, with citizens pressing close to the ceremonial procession to catch a glimpse of the young queen whose name had become the focus of diplomacy and intrigue. She wore a crown crafted for a child, a delicate circlet of gold and jewels, and her train was carried by ladies chosen for their loyalty and ability to guide her through the labyrinth of English court etiquette. Tutors began their relentless instruction in languages, music, and courtly manners, while also preparing her for the delicate calculations of politics she would one day be expected to perform. Yet, beneath the pageantry and ceremonial rigor, Isabella's life was governed by pressures incomprehensible to most children. Every lesson, every interaction was measured against the backdrop of dynastic expectation. Could a girl so small truly grasp the weight of her new title? Could her innocence coexist with the necessity of strategic observation and careful speech? Even as she learned to curtsy and speak English fluently, the court's undercurrents, hidden alliances, rivalries, and whispers of ambition already tested her understanding of loyalty and danger. As the Abbey's shadows lengthened, Isabella, poised yet fragile, became both a jewel of diplomacy and a figure of haunting inevitability. The innocence of her childhood, so stark against the grandeur of royal expectation, left a question lingering in the minds of those who observed her. What does it mean for a child to bear a crown, when the world demands more than she can yet comprehend? And as the wind rattled once more against the stained glass, it whispered a promise. The story of this forgotten queen was only beginning, and the darkness beyond her first coronation held trials that would test the limits of survival, loyalty, and the very definition of power. Rain hammered against the leaded windows of Westminster Palace, turning the stone corridors into rivers of echoing footsteps. The wind shrieked through the towers, rattling tapestries and sending flickers of candlelight dancing across the carved oak panels. You can almost feel the chill creeping down your spine, the scent of wet wool and burning tallow mixing with the iron tang of damp stone, as the palace itself seems alive with unease. Outside, courtiers whispered in fear and awe of the king whose grief weighed like armor on his shoulders, and the child he was sworn to protect, a queen in miniature, yet the fulcrum of peace between two kingdoms. Richard II moved through the palace with a quiet tension, the crown on his head a constant reminder of both power and fragility. Since Isabella's arrival, his life had become a delicate balance of paternal care and monarchical duty. Every decision, from the smallest courtly gesture to the grandest ceremonial decree, carried consequences that rippled far beyond the stone walls. In the privacy of her chambers, he would kneel to her level, adjusting her posture as she practiced the proper curtsies, offering gentle corrections in his measured voice. "Your hand must float lightly over the hem," he instructed once, his gaze lingering with a mix of authority and an almost imperceptible warmth. To Isabella, these moments were confusing, yet strangely comforting, an intimacy shaped by circumstance, framed by the rigid expectations of monarchy. Beyond these quiet lessons, Richard navigated the treacherous landscape of English nobility. Factional rivalries pulsed beneath the gilded veneer of courtly manners. Nobles whispered in corners, eyes flicking toward the king, questioning his loyalty to his advisors, his generosity to allies, and even the wisdom of marrying a child to seal a fragile peace. Richard understood the stakes. Isabella was not just a queen. She was a symbol, a bridge between England and France, a living embodiment of promises he had made and treaties that had yet to be tested. He would often pace the long galleries at night, listening to the patter of rain against stone, wondering if the people he trusted most might one day turn that symbol into a weapon against him. Their days followed a rhythm of instruction, ceremony, and quiet observation. Isabella learned to read English and French fluently, her tutors spreading maps and chronicles across polished tables while explaining battles, alliances, and betrayals. Richard himself took interest, guiding her through the complex network of loyalties that defined his reign. "See here," he would say, pointing to Dover on a parchment map, "this narrow channel has carried armies, ambassadors, and the fate of our nations. Remember, your marriage is no tale of affection. It is the very peace that shields thousands from the sword." In these moments, Isabella's wide eyes reflected both understanding and awe, yet the weight of these lessons pressed upon her like a shadow that would grow heavier with every passing year. Evenings brought a quieter intimacy. Richard would present her with small gifts from his journeys across England, books, trinkets, or curious objects from distant markets, and sometimes they would sit together, listening to the harp's gentle chords echoing through the chamber. Courtiers speculated endlessly about the king's affection for the child queen, yet none could fully perceive the complexity of their bond. It was not love in the conventional sense, nor was it simple guardianship. It was a coexistence of vulnerability and authority, care and political necessity, every gesture and glance measured against the imperatives of survival and diplomacy. Yet the court never truly slept. Even as Isabella learned to navigate her new surroundings, whispers of discontent grew louder. Some nobles mocked the king's tenderness toward the child, seeing it as weakness, while others plotted to exploit her presence to pressure Richard into concessions. Letters crossed the channel in secret, French envoys reporting Isabella's health, education, and temperament, all while English nobles debated the wisdom of treaties they themselves did not fully understand. Every action of the child queen, every misstep, was scrutinized and catalogued as if her very behavior could determine the fate of nations. Through it all, Isabella remained astonishingly composed, absorbing lessons in etiquette and politics with a precocity that belied her years. She began to notice the subtle cues of courtly power, the tilt of a head, a hushed exchange behind a fan, the strategic placement of courtiers during meals. Richard watched, silently approving her growing acumen, yet acutely aware that the moment would come when the protections of his care could no longer shield her from the sharp edge of political reality. And so, as the storm raged outside and the palace seemed to groan under the weight of history itself, Isabella and Richard continued their quiet, fragile duet. One hand on her elbow, one eye on the court, Richard balanced the impossible. The care of a child, the security of a queen, and the ever-looming threat of betrayal. Each day drew them closer to an inevitable confrontation with the outside world, a world where innocence and power would collide, where the line between protector and pawn blurred, and where the lessons of loyalty, fear, and survival would shape the young queen's destiny in ways neither of them could yet predict. The Tower of London loomed above the misty, cobbled streets, its grim silhouette etched against a gray October sky. Rain-slicked stones gleamed beneath the weak light, and the echo of armored footsteps reverberated in narrow passageways as if the fortress itself were breathing. Every barred window and iron-bound door whispered a chilling truth. Safety is fragile, and even royalty is not immune to the sudden collapse of power. In the heart of this ancient prison palace, a 9-year-old girl would discover the terrifying weight of dynasties, the cruelty of ambition, and the stark reality that treaties, crowns, and vows could all be swept aside in a heartbeat. Isabella of Valois had been raised to embody peace, yet the world she had come to know at Westminster Palace began to crumble almost overnight. Her husband, King Richard II, was dethroned in the turbulent spring of 1399, forced to surrender the crown he had inherited as a child, much like she had. Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, assumed the English throne, a man whose ascent was both swift and ruthless. Isabella's position shifted instantly from queen to political instrument, a symbol of continuity to her father, a bargaining chip to her new captors, and a young girl caught in the maelstrom of ambitions far larger than herself. The first encounter with Henry's envoys was chilling in its subtle menace. Isabella, escorted through the tower's stone corridors, was met by men who wore the livery of the new king, red roses stitched onto dark velvet, symbols of authority and the promise of surveillance. They spoke with careful formality, measuring every word, gauging the child's reactions. "Your Grace," one envoy intoned, "the king bids that your household be adjusted to new oversight, and that your conduct reflect the dignity expected of one in your position." Isabella's dark eyes, sharp despite her years, registered both the threat and the underlying promise. Obedience might mean comfort, defiance could bring confinement, or worse. The tower itself became both refuge and prison. The rooms were spacious but stark, tapestries removed or replaced with heavy drapes that absorbed sound, giving the impression that even the walls listened. Her French attendants whispered counsel in quiet corners, their hushed words carrying strategies, warnings, and fragments of hope. Isabella, though still a child, began to parse the nuances of survival in a court now ruled by fear and uncertainty. Every visitor, every messenger, became a test of her comprehension of political nuance. could she appear compliant without surrendering her dignity? Could she gather intelligence without inciting suspicion? Richard's absence was felt as a void that no tutor or envoy could fill. Though she had never loved him as a wife might, Isabella recognized in him the last remnant of her security, a guardian whose authority had protected her from the predatory intricacies of noble factions. His removal and eventual death shattered the fragile equilibrium she had relied upon, leaving her exposed to both the ambitions of Henry IV and the complicated expectations of her father, Charles VI. Letters arrived from Paris, some offering solace, others demanding obedience. Yet none could shield her from the immediate threats that circled the tower like hawks waiting for prey. Negotiations for her release to France became a tense chess match. Henry's representatives framed the proposition with calculated civility. Isabella could return to her father's court, but only if she acknowledged Henry as the rightful king and formally renounced her claims as Richard's widow. The terms were merciless, yet artfully diplomatic. To refuse meant indefinite detention, possibly under harsher conditions. To accept meant relinquishing the status she had known, leaving England behind and stepping into a future she could scarcely imagine. For a child of 9, the choices were bewildering, yet each carried consequences with echoes across kingdoms. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was marked by a bittersweet tension. Isabella left behind the halls where she had learned to curtsy, the gardens where she had played, and the people who had become her companions and mentors. The English streets she had once marveled at now seemed alien, and the return to Paris, though outwardly comforting, presented new challenges. A father increasingly consumed by madness, a court wary of a girl shaped by years in England, and the knowledge that her every action could be interpreted as either loyalty or rebellion. The child who had been queen now carried exile in her small hands, the weight of political necessity pressing heavily upon her shoulders. In these months, Isabella's character, education, and resilience became her shields. She learned to navigate a world in which youth was no protection, where diplomacy could be lethal, and where innocence might be mistaken for weakness. Her story, at this juncture, raises haunting questions. What is the cost of dynastic ambition when it is imposed on a child? How does one measure the loss of freedom against the promise of survival? And as she gazed from the decks of her returning ship, the churning waters beneath echoing the uncertainty of her fate, it became painfully clear that crowns, like shadows, are fleeting, and that the lessons of power come at the highest cost.